and makes sense when you're talking about mythological creatures that really, I mean, do they have to hurt each other in a traditional way? That's very human. But if they're supernatural, then they're going to fight on a totally different level.
Metaphysical level where it just like becomes whole spectacle. And I think especially in the written word, having some kind of philosophical fight scene would actually might even be easier than doing it in film, which is it's usually the other way around.
Welcome to Speculative Sandbox, your audio playground for creative storytellers. My name is Vicky Lawn, and each episode, I and a guest will unpack a fiction trope with an eye for character development and narrative structures. Make sure to look for Speculative Sandbox on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, where you can join the conversation. Leave comments or questions, or let us know what other tropes we should cover. When the real world just doesn't cut it, let's get lost in a fictional one. Yeah! No, not that kind of fighting word, although that certainly plays a part. Fight sequences. They're the ultimate showdown between protagonist and antagonist. Whether physical, emotional, or metaphysical, fight sequences are not only thrilling, they should mean something to the overall plot. I'm so excited to bring writer Matthew C. Brown back to the podcast to talk about fighting words. You may remember him from our episodes on problematic protagonists and shared universes. This time we talk about our favorite fights and how to write them. How's your morning going so far?
Oh, not too bad. I don't know. I went to the dentist, and that's not fun.
I went to the dentist too.
Oh my God! Did you have to get a cavity filled also?
I have 3 that I scheduled for September.
No, I'm sorry. Yeah, I was in last week, and they were just like, "Oh, you got 2 cavities." And I'm like, I what now?" I don't know, like right. It was so funny. Like literally before we moved from Nashville, I went to the dentist like 2 days before we moved, and they had to fill a cavity. So I was trying to like move boxes and stuff, and my mouth was numb, and I was just like, "Oh, this is terrible." And like I don't know, they found like 3 at the time, and I got like real anxious about my teeth. And I've been like doing pretty well for the past couple of years, and then this last time they were just like, "Oh, like you got 2 cavities," and I'm like, "Oh, great."
Oh, yeah. I've had the same dentist for over 20 years. It was like a family dentist, and he suddenly, right after, maybe even during COVID, just sold the business, disappeared. And the next time I went in, it was a different dentist, different staff entirely.
No.
I
Oh,
was
that's
like, what?
worse.
And I've noticed that this guy has, I can tell there's a difference in the treatments. Like they use laser drills rather than
Okay.
like the traditional drills.
Right,
And they
right.
have all these processes I've never experienced before. And I'm like, maybe my dentist is really old school, but my new hygienist is really rough. I have to listen to music and take Tylenol before I go. And I'm like, is this
Uh,
normal?
I don't know. My family dentist originally was just so like I don't know. She was. It was the classic like, your gums are bleeding a lot. I'm like, you are scraping my gums with your hook. And I felt like I didn't get like a legitimately good cleaning until I finally moved out. And it was just like, oh, is this what
Oh.
it's supposed to be like? Like doctors that don't make me feel like I'm destroying my teeth every day.
Yeah, I know. I have a perfectionism problem. And so as they're talking to each other, talking about my gum sizes and stuff, I'm just like, where am I messing up? Like it gives me so much
Uh-huh.
anxiety. I was anxious about scheduling any teeth, like actual getting my cavities done this month because I've gotten all these episodes to record back to back to back. And I really didn't want to have to figure out how to get around the numbing and healing. So I'm glad that at least it's just a cleaning today. Do you have to, did you also get your cavities done today or just the
I
cleaning?
got them. I got them filled this morning, but I had it scheduled, so it was like 10 o'clock over by me. So that was like what? It's like 5-ish hours before
Okay.
now. So like
You can
I
talk?
had, I had looked, and I mean, I wasn't and I was talking pretty okay after the appointment. Um, so but I had planned it like, okay, like it should wear off by that time. So I
Mhm.
should have been still good to talk, but I was also pretty good after that. So it didn't end up being as bad as I thought it was. I couldn't really drink anything because it would slop out of my mouth. And I'm
Oh,
just like,
yeah.
oh, yeah, favorite thing.
Well, I'm glad you're here. You don't
Anyway,
sound like you went through any kind of procedure, so that's
good.
good. Thank you for coming back. This is now take 3 with you, right? This is the third
Yes, I
conversation.
think so. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I know we have repeat listeners who already know who you are, but can you introduce yourself a little bit, especially for our newcomers?
My name is Matthew C. Brown. I am a science fiction fantasy writer. I've most recently released a short story, which is up on my website at mattbrownwrites.com. It is a sci fi Western story. If you like cowboys with velociraptors, I'm your guy.
I love the story. Someone who lives in the Wild Wild West myself, I really was drawn to your world building and how you played with the desert landscape. I won't say too much other than you have, they're called night cactus, right?
Yes, the night cacti.
The night cactus, which I think is such a creative way of looking at the world around where I am, at least. I look out my window, there's tons of cacti right now. And I'm just like, could you imagine if those things were burning at night? Amazing, amazing.
Thank you. That's definitely one of my favorite flora or fauna in the world building.
Hmm. All right. So today we are talking about fight scenes, which I find to be really fun and interesting because there's the fight scenes you watch, but then as anything in entertainment, everything has to start from one place, which means it has to be written down. So whether or not you're watching a movie, a kung fu movie, or just a James Bond movie, and you have all the intricacies of editing and action sequences, you still have to write it down. And then of course you have fight scenes in books. So let's jump in. What is a fight scene and what part does it play in the overall story?
So I think a fight scene can be best described as a physical confrontation between two or more people. I say typically because in some cases, like the characters might not be actually physically touching. I mean, there's a difference between if it's if it is like a kung fu hand to hand fight, and then like I don't know if it's a Western showdown.
Mm-hmm.
It's two very they're using guns. They're not actually hitting each other, but you could still call that a fight because they're both trying to you know cause harm to each other. And these fight scenes could range anywhere from being like a one-on-one duel to kind of like a small group brawl or like a full scale battle that you might see in like a historical war movie or Game of Thrones or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always find that fight scenes, I think in order to have like a lot of impact plot wise, they have to have some sort of impact on the motives or the stakes that the characters are fighting. I think about like the bare bones. I always think of boxing movies, where all right, you've got to fight. It's a fight scene. You've got two people in the ring and they're duking it out, but that fight has to mean something beyond just the fight itself, whether it's the main character fighting for freedom or approval or validation. It has to feed into something.
Exactly. Like every single Rocky movie, it's not just about, there's all this buildup to the fight itself. And they always kind of have a different motive behind each of them. Like in the first movie, it's like he's an underdog and he's being given a shot against the champion. And then the second one, it was like he did so good the first time, and it's kind of like, okay, you have to prove that that wasn't a fluke.
Hmm.
And so every single time there's some new motivation, and it's just like if you watch the boxing scene itself, it's obviously entertaining because I mean people watch boxing all the time, like they just like watching people slug
Hmm.
each other out, but the whole movie builds up a story to it. There's all this leading up in terms of character motivation, and I mean we can obviously have movies where fighting is just the shtick. If you go to see John Wick, you're not really going because you want to see like John Wick have a huge character arc. You mostly just want to see him kick a bunch of people's butts.
Hmm.
Like if you have a movie like that, that's just what you go in for. You go in for strictly an action movie. You just want to see some really cool action, and you can get that. Hopefully with at least some engaging stakes to surround it.
What I love about the John Wick movies is because I'm actually one of those weird viewers that doesn't like. isn't as enthusiastic about the fight scenes. I love the lore, the mythology that I think fuels the fight scenes and makes them really interesting and forms the characters. And of course, all the lighting and the world building and the set designs that come with that. It's a beautiful movie to watch, even though it's very violent.
Yeah, it is kind of unique in that regard because they do have that interesting underworld. Which if you just watch the first movie, it's very they don't do a whole lot with it. It's kind of kept very mysterious,
Mm-hmm.
and they obviously have built upon that with each successive movie, which I think makes sense. Like if you're gonna keep us engaged, um, in a movie like that, because I mean the first movie is pretty much just a straightforward revenge movie. With I mean, and let's be real, it's a very powerful motive. They killed his dog.
Yeah.
Like I mean, if you shorthand wants to get anybody to feel sympathetic for someone, bad guy killed their dog, you are going to be totally in their corner for the
Mm-hmm.
entire like 90-minute, 100-minute run.
I love that there is a website. I believe it's doesthedogdie.com.
Yeah.
com.
Yes, there is. Yes, there is. We were watching the movie Prey, and my wife looked that up right before we watched the movie.
It's an important resource. Like I've used
It
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 so many
is.
times.
It is.
Some other examples I have for like what defines a fight scene, as far as character development goes, the classic, I think of Back to the Future. The father's name, which I'm forgetting, against Biff in the
Is it
first movie.
George? George?
George, yes.
Yes.
George is just this pathetic underdog, and Michael J. Fox's character is trying to push up his confidence the entire time. And at the very end, you see him finally defending himself in a very short, fight scene. But it shows like where the stakes are all there. We're all hanging by the same stakes as whether or not this guy could even accomplish defending himself. And it comes through there. And then the other type of fight scene I really like is actually not your traditional physical fight scene, because you talked about like a physical fight scene versus a non-physical fight scene. I like philosophical fight scenes. So, you've been watching The Sandman, right?
I haven't.
Okay.
I've. It's so surprising. For as much as I like Neil Gaiman, I have
Mhm.
never read Sandman, and I know the series has gotten some great reviews so far, but I'm kind of stuck in the. Do I want to watch that or read it first?
Oh,
But
okay. Good point. I just decided to jump. I jumped into. I'm going to give it one episode and see, because I haven't read either. I've read American Gods. I've read some of his other stuff. Um, but what is it? Everworld? Is that his other book, or Evermore? I can't remember.
Nevermore, I believe, is what.
Nevermore.
Yeah.
Yes, I've read that. And so I've always loved the way he approaches mythologies. And after the first episode, I was like, okay, we're going to keep going and see what this is about. I love that the main character makes me think of like the early 2000s scene kid. He's a total emo guy, like with the sideways hair. He just needs eyeliner. So I'm just really, it's fun for me to watch him. But there's a fight scene. I'm almost hesitant to say it now, but okay, later on between two characters, there is a philosophical fight scene, and you think that it's going to be a physical one, but instead, what they do is they present concepts. And the concepts are about symbols of violence, like I am a dire wolf. And the other person says, well, actually, I'm a hunter and I shoot your dire wolf. And the other person counters and says, I'm a snake. And the other, you know what I mean? They go back, the other one says, I'm a bird of prey, and they keep building and building and building until they're talking about I'm the world and I am a supernova and I am the universe and I am antimatter. It becomes super philosophical, but at the same time they're creating visuals, and as they're hurting each other philosophically, it's having an effect on their physical body, which I thought was so unique and makes sense when you're talking about mythological creatures that really, I mean, do they have to hurt each other in a traditional way? That's very human. But if they're supernatural, then they're going to fight on a totally different level.
Yeah, I'm always fascinated by the different ways people can come up with fight scenes that just evolve beyond just the simple punching and kicking and whatnot. Especially when you can get to this whole other like metaphysical level where it just like becomes it becomes this whole spectacle. And I think especially that should especially I can't think of any examples off the top of my head, but like in the written word having some kind of philosophical fight scene. would actually might even be easier than doing
Hmm.
it in film, which is it's usually the other way around.
Yeah, that's very true. Another example I have too of a non-fight scene. Well, it starts off, it's Marvel, you have to have a fight scene. But at the end of WandaVision, where Vision is fighting White Vision and they just stop and have a
Yes,
philosophical discussion.
I know. I love that whole bit, and they're
Hmm.
just like rapidly figuring out. Yes, yes, that is another great example.
Yeah. So then based off of how we've defined fight scenes and the parts they play in the stories, what are some iconic ones, your absolute favorites?
So before I sat down to write this, I had to stop myself and say, like, Matthew, you cannot talk about Star Wars the entire time because as you gotta give a chance for some other movies. So I tried to really narrow my focus here. But
Okay.
I did. The first thing that did come to my mind was the duel between Luke and Vader in The Empire Strikes Back.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's interesting with Star Wars because they're obviously chock full of fight scenes, and the lightsaber duels are always a big highlight. And you know, I know that most people would say that the lightsaber duels you see in the prequel movies are better on a technical level, and I agree with that. But I think if you're talking about a fight scene that serves the story better, I think the original trilogy uh, does a bit of a better job
Mm-hmm.
with that. So that's why I decided to go with Luke versus Vader uh, as just an incredibly iconic fight scene, arguably the most in the whole saga.
It's interesting too that you mentioned that as far as like how it contributes to the story and plot and characters, because if you're just looking at it for the Flash, then you look at the prequels and it's a dance, right? They're
It is,
very
yeah.
advanced.
Yeah, they are, and I mean that does fit obviously with the if you're going into like the world building of Star Wars. That like the prequel movies, they feature Jedi in their prime, so
Mm-hmm.
yes, like it makes sense that they would be faster, more intense. These are people that have been training since childhood in
Mm-hmm.
these roles, and I mean they are great fights, and I love them. But like most of them are just for flash and for
Mm-hmm.
technicality, and they're there because you expect them to be there. Like I think the one that serves the story most is Anakin versus Obi-Wan at the end
Mm.
of Revenge of the Sith. But even that, like, it's a long fight. Like, did it need to? And I want to say this before anyone gets mad. I love that fight. It is wonderful. Did it need to be that long? Like like we get a lot of the emotional turmoil in the fight, and we understand the struggle between the two characters and why it's such an emotional battle. But still, I mean, I haven't compared the actual running times, but I know that I'm pretty sure that's the longest lightsaber duel out of anything in the entire saga. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but I think that Luke versus Vader, just like there's just so much built up to it because this is the first time that our protagonist and antagonist meet face to face. Like it weirdly hasn't happened yet. You usually, when you're talking about any kind of like science fiction fantasy movie, like they've maybe faced off at least once, and this is the end of the second movie.
Mm.
Uh, no, go ahead.
No, that's a good point because when you think about the first movie, it's just solely it's a rescue mission and they blow up a building. They blow up a
They
spaceship.
blow up a lot.
But at this whole time, they're completely on opposite ends of like meeting each other. That is very
Exactly.
unusual. Do you think that
Yeah.
would fly now today if like you were to pitch A New Hope?
Um, I don't know. I mean, I think if you approach it from the point of view of like framing New Hope as a classic fantasy story under the lens of a space opera, I think that would work.
Mm-mm.
But I mean, I remember as a kid being a little disappointed that Luke didn't get to have a lightsaber duel
Oh
in the first
yeah.
movie. Like, and I mean, obviously, now I understand why you know that doesn't really work. And I mean, I don't think it would have been a better movie to actually have it in there. But you're kind of expecting it,
Yeah.
uh, and then now this is and which, but that just makes it all the more tense
Mm-hmm.
because now it's like, okay, now he's actually had training, uh, and now he actually gets to go up against. Vader. But the thing is, like, we actually really don't know how it's gonna go because literally, I mean, Yoda and Obi-Wan were both like, "Look, you're not ready," and we also know that he's not ready either. Like, we're like, yeah, like he's still pretty inexperienced, but he goes to do it anyway because he wants to save his friends because he knows
Mhm.
they're in trouble. Which, I mean, that's just that's just Luke. Luke's like, yeah, I know it's dangerous, but I'm gonna go anyway.
When I
Um,
first watched that movie, by the way, from the part where he's training and then decides to go save them, I had so much anxiety because I looked at what he trained on and what he was planning to do, and I'm like, I don't even feel ready.
no, not at all. And I mean, especially since we've seen, I mean, Vader's like almost never been Vader's had like the upper hand for pretty much, two whole movies now. The only time he's ever really been caught off guard was like during the Death Star trench run when he gets knocked off course. But otherwise he's powerful. I mean, he defeated Obi-Wan. I mean, you could debate whether he quote unquote defeated him. Obi-Wan sacrificed himself, but anyway, not to get too technical. Uh, but when we watch this fight, you know, it's clear that Luke is giving it his all. Like, he really is trying to fight Vader because he thinks that this is the man that killed my father. This is the man that killed Ben Kenobi. This is the man that put my friends in danger, and I am going to defeat him. And then you have Vader, who is just clearly toying with him for most of the fight. He could have killed Luke several times, but he
Mhm.
doesn't, which we learn why he doesn't kill Luke. Uh, and I think that's the other thing is that at the end of the fight, at the end of the movie, Luke loses. And like
Yeah.
he loses pretty badly. I mean, he loses a hand, he's beaten and scarred, and he mentally, uh, after the great revelation, he is mentally just messed up.
Hmm.
And like and that's the thing, that's where the movie ends. Like most of the time, if the hero loses a fight, it's like maybe like act two, or
Hmm.
like if they're gonna lose a fight, it's gonna be earlier in the movie so that they can then like beat the villain later when they're better or they've learned the power of friendship or something like that. And then they can be. But no, Luke loses, just straight up loses, and he is just left in just an absolute the lowest he's ever been in the whole series of movies thus far.
Yeah. What did you think of the in the Obi-Wan series, the final confrontation between Obi-Wan and Darth Vader?
I was like just holding my hands up to my mouth, like just like shaking the whole time. And I actually thought that fight, this is gonna be controversial, I'm sure, but I got a lot more emotion out of that fight than I did Revenge of the Sith.
Mm-hmm.
And it had nothing to do with the actual technical ability, although there were some things that I just loved on a fight choreography perspective on the Obi-Wan series. But it was just the fact that, like, I mean, you have like Obi-Wan has finally decided to stop running. He's finally decided to try and confront Vader. Um, and we've seen him go through that development. And you also see for Anakin, it's like he is just so focused on trying to take Obi-Wan down. Like that is just the only thing he has cared about. It's just uh and so that just loads up the whole fight where and it's crazy because we know you would think that the stakes would feel kind of low because like we know that neither of them die.
Mm-hmm.
So you would think that that kind of removes the stakes. Uh, but I don't feel like it does because we're so emotionally invested in it, especially at the end. Uh, like, and you could argue that something does kind of die at the end because at the end of that fight, Obi-Wan really just kind of accepts like Anakin is gone.
Mm-hmm.
Vader even says it like, I killed Anakin, like he's dead, he's gone. And I think that's when Obi-Wan finally just accepts it, like, yep, that's it. There's nothing more I can do to save my friend. He's gone.
Yeah.
And I feel like that just hits you hard.
Oh, it hit me hard. And I feel like that I have this theory because okay, cinematically, the Obi-Wan show did so much more for character development and relationships just because of the style, the lighting, the settings. Um, I have a theory that the prequels feel more like a ballet. I'll get to that in a minute.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, you see it too. Okay, good. Because and okay, so regarding the Obi-Wan thing, I needed that connection too, because Darth Vader has gone on to become what was already a legacy character, but went on beyond the prequels to be even a bigger legacy, whether it's through the side canon materials or in the parks or being referenced in the sequels. And I had a really hard time reconciling the Anakin of the prequels to the Darth Vader. And what I loved about this was it allowed that emotion to build. Whereas when I would watch the prequels, it's first of all filmed like everything's on a stage, obviously, very wooden, and then the the fighting is a dance. It's like I'm literally watching segments of Nutcracker, but it's fight scenes instead, and the music is non-stop. That drove me crazy. The non-stop music that literally informs you of every single emotional cue, very ballet. So anyway, that's my take.
There is a clip somewhere of like George Lucas walking into the office of his production staff or whatever before pre-production on Revenge of the Sith, and he's just finished writing the script and everyone's clapping, and he's like, there's a lot of they fight. Like that he just wrote they fight in the script. Which I mean, again, like what are you gonna do? Like obviously, like you're just writing the script, like you can't write it beat for beat in there, but it does say something when it's just like we're not really putting as many emotional beats in the actual fight. We're just going to let them make a dance and do the choreography and let that kind of stand on its own.
I have some other, are you ready to go away from Star Wars for a little bit? Or
yes, please. This we can go. We can go.
I love talking about Star Wars, by the way. I just wanted to talk about my next item and didn't want it to be like, all right, enough Star Wars, because I love Star Wars and I can talk forever about it as well. One fight scene that I really like, that really stood out to me because it's not it like the emotional. Okay. Have you seen Netflix's Daredevil series?
Yes.
Okay. The hallway fight scene.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought this up.
Yes. Okay. Okay. I love it for multiple reasons. Number one, it's like one big long take. And that allows us to see some very unique things. He's trying to rescue a child, I believe. I'm going off of memory here. And
yep,
he's
right.
working. He's right. Am I right?
Yep, you're right.
Okay. So then you walk down, he has to fight a bunch of guys in a hallway. And it's just one pan shot, and you see him rolling in and out of the side rooms, in and out of doorways, back into the hall, gets a child, walks out. But because it's one constant take, you are seeing the physical strain, and you realize how mortal this character is, but yet he persists because the point to save this child is so important. And then of course, you talk about the talent that is needed for a one take shot like this, for the stunt people, the actor, lighting, even the coordination of the camera. It really just all told a really cohesive story. So one of my favorites, hands down.
You could take that whole scene, like if they had just, and I mean they obviously wouldn't do this because they got to put out full-length episodes, but if they had just released that and that was meant to be just like an episode on its own, it would work.
Mm-hmm.
And people would love it, just the way it's shot. And I think, and you really hit the nail on the head with the physical toll, because that's something that I feel like in movies it's a little harder to really communicate the weariness of fighting, like because sometimes they just don't, sometimes they're just superhuman and they don't really show a lot of that, or they only show it like at a specific point in the battle, like toward the end. And here, because it's all continuous, you see, and that's a thing, that's a staple for most of the Daredevil show, is just he just gets tired because he's mortal, he's just one guy. He has he has his superpower, but he's not physically any different than a normal guy. And that really does come across very clear in that particular scene.
Yes. What other ones do you have?
I had picked moving to a more like larger battle scale. One of my, the Lord of the Rings trilogy is obviously stacked with battle scenes and fight scenes. My personal favorite is the Battle of Amon Hen, which is the final battle in the Fellowship of the Ring. And that's a much smaller battle compared to something like Helm's Deep from Two Towers or
Mm-hmm.
Pelennor Fields. But I love it because the dramatic tension and emotion is just through the roof for that
Is that
fight.
where they all separate afterwards? My
That's where
memory's
they all
fine.
separate
Okay.
because Frodo realizes that he has to finish the quest on his own, and Aragorn is like, yeah, he does. And so really the whole point of that is just the fellowship is fighting so that Frodo can get away. Like this is
Mm-hmm.
not, and one of my favorite tropes is just like a small force of like extraordinary heroes like facing overwhelming odds. And they're it's 8 people, and 4 of them are hobbits who aren't particularly good in battle versus like 100 Urukai, and then they're not even really trying to win. It's that they're trying to make sure Frodo can get across the river.
Mm-hmm.
So like they just that the whole fight is just them trying to just protect him, and it's just very different than like the typical goal being just like one side is trying to beat the other. Like
Yeah.
obviously they want to live, but that's not what their goal is. Their goal is to defend Frodo.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just the whole time it's just electrifying because it's all this selflessness, and then of course it ends with one of the Fellowship getting killed, which really just, I mean, that's the second time in the movie that someone is dying. I mean, I know that Gandalf doesn't actually die, but to us, I mean, when I
Yeah.
first watched that movie, not having read the book, I was like, wait, is he like dead? He's dead. He's not coming back
Mm-hmm.
because he didn't show up later like we thought he would. Uh, and that just really kind of highlights the self-sacrifice nature of this particular fight.
I love talking about some of these classic films. I say classic, I don't feel classic. Maybe because I'm getting old. But anyway, especially when we talk about how like some of these, like I feel like the going back real quick to Star Wars, the Luke Vader, how the standoff happens later in the series rather than in the first movie. And I find that a lot of movies that try to copy that, fast forward it, that
Oh,
model,
absolutely.
and you have this as well where you have the sad cliffhanger. I had a really hard time with this cliffhanger because I read parts of the book as a child, didn't get through all of it, saw the movie. The movie was a helpful way for me to understand the book. Both movie and the book I was like, yes, you have this community of people coming together to help. And I was really devastated when they broke up. And I was like, do I want to read the next book where they're separated? Just because I thought they were so strong together. And you feel like a security blanket, like each person brings their own skill set and training, and now that security blanket is gone, and it's kind of scary from that point
It
forward.
It really is. And I don't, and not when you're talking about a trilogy, I feel like the first movie usually ends pretty triumphantly for the good
Mhm.
guys for the most part. Like if you think about, the first Star Wars movie, the first Matrix movie, or, that most of the time, like the first movie ends pretty good for the heroes. And here it like doesn't really like most of them live, and that's about it. Like that, like, yeah, the bad guy doesn't have the ring, and that's really the only plus
Mhm.
about the whole thing. But otherwise, like they're in shambles.
Yeah, I have one other, and I'm trying to. I would like to, but I don't think mine's that great. I just put
Yeah,
the
go for
Matrix
it. Go for
movies.
it.
Okay. Um,
I purposely did not mention. I personally did not go into them because I figured that you would probably want to do that.
okay. Well, so then we have the Matrix movies, which they stand out to me simply because visually they set a standard that was iconic, the bullet time um filming style, and how they elevated science fiction fighting as a result. And you've seen it copied. I mean, they copied it in Smallville almost immediately after, where you have Clark Kent running in slow motion. Everything's in slow motion. He's just kind of sauntering around, but really, he's really fast. And I have yet, and I guess this is a question more to you. Have you seen anything since that has revolutionized fight filmmaking?
I mean, I don't know if I'd say revolution. I mean, I would say influenced. And I had made notes about this for a later question, but uh, a lot of action movies tried to kind of copy the style of the Bourne movies after
Mm.
those came out, where the action is very like quick, like it's very, it's not like it's kind of it's the exact opposite of the Daredevil uh fight scene, where it's a lot of quick cuts,
Mm-hmm.
uh which is, and a little bit of shaky camera in there, which is really meant to kind of demonstrate just the quick and deadly efficiency that Jason Bourne has. And a lot of action movies after that did try to incorporate like the quick cut shaky cam method of shooting an action scene, which I wouldn't say it's revolutionary in the same way that like The Matrix was,
Mm-hmm.
but it certainly did influence other movies.
I saw that. I think you and I talked about this very briefly. The tight editing in James Bond Quantum of Solace, which is the one that came out directly after Casino Royale, right? I hope I
Yes.
have. Okay.
Yep.
I remember loving Casino Royale. I know that they revolutionized James Bond, new actor, new approach to him. And then Quantum of Solace rolls in, and the action scenes were so like cut up that I couldn't actually tell what was happening. That was how tight they were. And I was kind of sad. And then I lost my own personal stakes. I didn't feel worried about him because I couldn't even follow the action. And this isn't me being old. This is me like in my 20s. I couldn't
No,
figure
no,
it
no.
out.
I agree. Quantum of Solace is. I mean, there's a lot of good things I do like about the movie, but they don't really get all the way there. It's definitely and I haven't seen uh, No Time to Die yet, but I do think it is the weakest of the Craig movies.
Okay. So then going off from here,
Yeah.
getting in this other, I know a lot of people are probably worried. Okay, you guys have talked about all these great things. What are some bad things so that we know to stay away from that? So what would you say makes a bad fight scene?
I think above all else, the worst kind of fight scene is one that is not necessary.
Okay.
Uh, and if you go, and kind of like I said earlier, if you go to a movie like John Wick or a Jackie Chan movie or something, like you're going to expect fighting and you're going to see fighting. And even if it's not, it doesn't really have to serve much of a story purpose. Like we're there to just watch Keanu Reeves, just kill a bunch of guys and do it in a really cool way. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what we came to see. And that's fine. But sometimes it's just not necessary to accomplish what you want, especially if you're writing a book. It's absolutely not necessary.
Oh gosh.
That is the absolute worst thing
It's
you
a
can
lot
do, in
of
my
wasted
opinion.
time for you too as the writer to like
Yeah.
coordinate all that. I think too about any war movie, fantasy war movie in particular, that hasn't properly set up the stakes between the two opposing sides. So I don't know why I should care about whether or not the main characters are winning.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I mean, you can have you don't need to have both sides completely invested. Like if you just want your good guy to be facing, like there's some war movies where, like especially if it's a real life movie where the enemy's kind of faceless, you know, and we
Mm-hmm.
really only have stakes for the quote unquote good guys or whatever, then that's okay. But if you have something like I'm trying to think if we could. I don't know. There are definitely times when like there are like people fighting, and you're like, I don't know why anyone is doing anything, and I don't care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think come too much complexity too. Okay, like when you're trying to do too many things at once in a fight scene, and that causes confusion for me. That happens to me a lot with reading though. And that's because when there's a fight scene, I do this weird thing. I skim with fight scenes. And I think it's because I'm so anxious. I don't know if you can tell I'm a bit of an anxious person. Um, I get anxious in fight scenes and I want to know what's happening. So I start darting around the page. Like I take a diagonal path down the page, finding keywords and mashing them together and figuring out a narrative. So I'm skimming like, okay, what's happening? Is everything okay? Is everything okay? And then
Yeah,
when things get too complex, I'm like, now I'm lost. And that's my fault. But I do think that there is beauty in simplicity.
yeah. You really should. Less is more, especially in the written word. Less is definitely more, and I think that could be the case for film as well. Like obviously, film we at least have the benefit of a visual spectacle, but there isn't always. It is not always necessary to have a big fight scene.
Mm-hmm.
Like there are other, and and sometimes that could just be to the detriment of the movie.
Do you think that with like the blockbusters and Marvel and all that stuff, that fight scenes seem to become the default when it comes to big, I don't know, like climax pieces? You know what I mean? Like, does it always have to be a fight scene, or is that just what we become used to?
I mean, I think we would have been used to that even before this rise of this superhero renaissance, if you want to call it that. I think even before that, we just we're just built to expect something. Like, I mean, if you want to go all the way back to like the classic Hollywood swashbucklers, which are just
Hmm.
all about sword fighting, and they almost always have some kind of big climactic sword fight. Like it's going to be there. We just kind of expect it. And if you want to consider like the superheroes kind of echoing that, I will say that there are some movies that have kind of pushed back a little bit on this notion. One example would be Captain Marvel, where at the end of the movie, I don't remember his character, but Jude Law's character,
Mm-hmm.
they're standing in the middle of the desert, and she's all powerful. She's got her powers, and he does this thing where he's like trying to goad her into like, I want you to fight me, like, with no powers, like just one on one. Prove to me that you can be. And she just like shoots him with an energy
Hmm.
wave, and he goes blasted against the cannon wall. And she's like, I don't have to prove anything to you.
Yes.
And that's a great example. Like, they didn't have a big climactic fight between the two, that like, and you're expecting it too, because the movie starts with them doing like a sparring session, uh and you
Hmm.
think naturally, okay, like they're gonna have some kind of rematch, because you see that all the time when they do the like mentor slash friend turned enemy trope. They usually do have some kind of rematch
Yeah.
later on. And in this case, she's just and he obviously knows she's stronger, so he's just trying to say like, you got to get on my level to really prove that you're
Hmm.
actually that strong. She's like, no, I don't. And that works. And not only does that do they just do away with the big fight scene, it serves the story, because it's like the whole story has been about her having to prove herself when she hasn't really needed to prove anything to anyone other than herself.
That's a really interesting take. Yes, the idea that she hasn't had to prove anything the whole time, but she's dealt with that pressure, obviously, because now we know that mentor was toxic, was a bad person, and how she was able to like that was the real conflict. That relationship versus the fighting. I always feel like in lieu of fights, so we think about like, in WandaVision and the philosophical confrontation, and in the Sandman situation, if it's not a fight, then I feel like it has to do the equivalent of a fight, which is to like itch our brains a little bit, right? Surprise us, entertain us, bring some value into the story, bring something full circle, resolve something. And as long as you're able to do that, it doesn't have to be like your traditional physical fight scene.
No, not at all. I mean, you can accomplish a lot of, and even if you do want to have some kind of physical confrontation, like, it doesn't have to be a long drawn out thing. Like, you can make it short and sweet. There's a lot of samurai movies where, like, when two people fight, it's not usually very drawn out. Like, it'll be like kind of quick, uh, almost like gun drawing in the old west. Like, a lot of times they do a showdown. Like, showdowns aren't long at all. Like, the longest part is the anticipation, waiting for them to stand there, and then like the clock strikes noon, and then they draw, and then that's it. And like, it's not really, it's all about the tension.
Hmm.
And it gets resolved right there. They don't need to have a huge shootout over it.
Do you have any other examples of bad fight scenes?
I'm actually going to talk about a bad fight scene that wasn't,
Okay.
as in, uh, they realized it was bad and they took it out of the movie.
Really? Oh, so we never
Yes.
got to see the fight scene.
No, we did not,
Okay, what is
because
it?
because they realized it was bad. It is from the end of Lord of the Rings: Return of the King.
Okay.
I'm going to go back to that. So at the end of Return of the King, there's the battle at the Black Gate, which is when Aragorn leads, like, this army in a last ditch attempt to distract Sauron so that Frodo can destroy the ring. Now, originally, when they shot this, Sauron himself was supposed to manifest physically and come out, and he and Aragorn were gonna fight each other. Like he was gonna come out, he was gonna
Really?
yes, he was gonna come out looking like he did in the prologue of Fellowship, like in the black armor. He was gonna have a mace and everything, and he would come out, and then he and Aragorn would fight, and the armies would fight too. But like it was supposed to be, this big dramatic set piece where Aragorn and Sauron are fighting one on one. Uh,
Okay.
uh, and then they shot it too. Like they shot the whole thing. You can see behind the scenes footage of the movie where Sauron is there. Someone is there as Sauron in full armor with the mace, and they're fighting. Um, and then they realized when they were in editing that in post production that it just wasn't necessary. And I mean, let's ignore the fact that this was not even in the book. This was nowhere to be found in the book, which like that's already a mark against it.
Yeah.
But why does he have to show up? Like, because Sauron has always been his most imposing. First of all, when he's not physically present, he's always been this very, uh, you know, overwhelming presence. Like with just the name, like it's always been just this atmosphere around him, like not
Hmm.
necessarily his physical threat. And then the other thing is that the whole point of that battle is not, they were, I believe they originally put that in because they wanted Aragorn to be doing something heroic, have some kind of heroic fight. But, they realized that it's not about the battle. It's about Frodo
Yeah.
trying to destroy the ring. And if they had kept in that fight scene, it would have, kind of cheapened Frodo's part of the story, because that's just not that wasn't what that whole part of the story was about. So we didn't need Sauron to show up. And they actually, technically the footage is still in the movie. They just CGI'd over Sauron and made it a cave troll instead.
Oh, really?
Yes. So if you go watch the movie again, you'll see Aragorn fighting a cave troll, which, and I mean, it's not really, it's not made into a huge deal the way you would expect Sauron to. He just kind of starts fighting this cave troll, but really they just, they put a cave troll over Sauron so that they were like, okay, like, well, we shot this footage. We got to do something with it. Let's make him fight a cave troll because that won't completely overshadow Frodo's part of the story. And Aragorn still has an action scene. He's still doing something.
Okay. Well, I mean, I really appreciate that they kept to the integrity of the story and the purpose of the story because
Yeah.
I feel like it would have cheapened Frodo's entire
Yeah.
role.
Absolutely. Like I remember learning about that. I was just like, what? They actually did that. It's unbelievable. But that's an example. Like Peter Jackson realized that would have been a mistake to include it. And it is important that we recognize when someone makes a correct choice and diverts from something that would have probably been, people would have been way more hard on Return of the King if they had put that in there.
So then let's talk about it from the writer's perspective, because now we are responsible for setting the foundation of fight scenes. And we've just talked about all the things that hinge on fight scenes. So how the heck do you even begin? Do you have fight scenes in your work? What do you use action figures? Do you mock it all out? What do you do?
I have heard of people using action figures, which I think is a great idea, and I love that idea. I don't personally do that. I do have a lot of action scenes. In the most recent book that I'm currently editing, there are more like in the science fiction western. There's a lot more shooty,
Okay.
which is a little bit easier to do because like you can just say that like you can make it pretty fast paced by just saying that like they shot at people, and that
Mhm.
they like you can still get into some technical aspects. So like maybe if there's a brief hand to hand moment, but otherwise not that complex. But the most recent one is more of your typical kind of fantasy with swords and melee combat. So I did write a lot of fighting for that. For I think the most important thing to remember that as a writer in the written word, your fight scene is never going to be as much of a blood pumping spectacle because you can't if you tried to write a fight scene that was just like a kung fu movie, it'd be like, oh, and then he punched, and then he kicked, and then he dodged, and then he got hit, and then he punched, and it's just nobody wants to read that. That would make me skip over the pages, absolutely.
Oh
uh
yeah, yeah.
for me personally, if I'm doing a larger battle scene, I like to get a pen and paper and just sketch out like the battlefield. uh
Okay.
and a lot of that has to do with just, we need to have a sense of place. We need to kind of know the geography of the fight. Um, and it's much the same way that in a movie, we you got to know what's going on, because if you have too much shaky cam or you're doing too many cuts and it just gets so disorienting and you don't know what's going on, then people aren't going to like your fight scene. It needs
Hmm.
to be clear. Um, and I think the same thing goes for the book, is that like you want to kind of know where your characters are and know what kind of the flow of the action is, and have an idea of where they are in your head, because if you don't know, then your audience isn't gonna know, and they're gonna get confused. And That's how I like to kind of see where everyone is. The other thing I like to do is I might sometimes, if I'm talking about like the nitty gritty, like an actual hand to hand, I might try and like physically mimic uh, what I want my character to do. Like if I'm pretending like, oh, like if someone is coming at me with I don't know, if someone's trying to like kick me in the head, like what would I do, and like what would that feel like, and I do like an action, or like what do I do if someone gets me in a headlock, and maybe I'll ask someone to put me in a headlock
Mm.
to get a good idea of that, uh just to sort of mimic it out, because then that helps when you're writing the actual physical movement of the character. And I mean, I don't think you know it's not always good to get into full blown stage direction, because if you're too much like, and then he brought his arm up to block diagonally, like you don't want to get too technical.
Yeah.
uh but you certainly can get into their head. I mean, like if you're in a headlock, like try and put yourself in that headspace, like, okay, you're in a headlock, like what does that feel like?
Yes, and being able to capture the character's fear, hesitation, because a lot of my confrontations tend to be dialogue driven, and there's a lot more questing, I guess you can say, where you're trying to get something accomplished, and the risk is whether or not you can reach it, and then you have the final confrontation, and then the actual fight is like a one and done, and I
Oh
was like,
yeah.
oh, I don't think I've actually had to choreograph a fight scene. And I've read plenty of books that do. And I find that books that do it really well do exactly what you say, which is get inside the character's head so that you understand the stakes. And then I've seen ones where they're so descriptive and so technical, they end up slowing down the pace and you get kind of lost in the action, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's that is really hard to avoid. And I've definitely done it before, where like I get a little too like blockbuster action movie in my fight scene, and then I just have to try to pare it down. Um, and they tell you this, like I took one script writing class when I was in college, and they talked about also like not giving too much stage direction in your script,
Mm,
uh, because you got to let the actors work it through them work through it themselves too. I mean, it's different if you're like, if someone stabs someone, it's like, okay, you obviously have to put that in there. But like you don't need to be super technical with like what specific movements they're doing or where they're going, because you got to let them have some freedom. I think the same thing can kind of go with in the written word, because you want your, sometimes it's easier with less description, because then you're you can trust your reader to fill in some of the blanks. you
hmm.
know like you do, like if you want to say like if the fight scene is kind of moving from, like, I don't know, if they're fighting on steps, and then you want to say like the fight continued onto the ramparts of the castle, you don't need an extremely detailed account of how they moved from the steps to the ramparts. Like you could just say that, and the reader will fill in the blank of like what that action is supposed to look like. Because if you get too technical, then like you said, it is going to kind of bog it down, and you don't really need all that in there. You just need to trust your reader to picture some of the more continuous action, and then when you gotta fill it in for a more emotional beat, or if someone gets physically injured, then that's when you go back in and you can get a little bit more technical.
I love the revisions process because I feel like that's what you have to do, right? Like you're like, okay, I just need to get stuff in there to know that stuff happens. And then the next time I go
Yeah,
through, fill it in.
yeah, exactly.
So for structuring fight scenes, I've been looking, especially like big, massive, epic, climactic fight scenes, because I feel like that's what a lot of stories are moving towards. And you're like, oh my gosh, the pressure's on. How can I can't just write about people fighting for like 10 pages straight. And so when after I started learning about, the writing process and taking writing more seriously about 4 years ago, I started really studying all the TV shows and movies that I was watching. And I was really intrigued by plots, the plot, three-part plot structures, all those things. And I wanted to see how they applied to fight scenes, actually. So I'm going to go back to Game of Thrones' episode, The Long Night, which is from the last season. It's not the last episode.
I think
Couple,
it's the third episode.
yeah, it's in a little bit. It's the big fight scene that resolves the Night King. And um, there's plenty of other episodes in the Game of Thrones series that has an entire episode dedicated to a fight scene. And I remember during the time that Game of Thrones was aired, that people would get really frustrated if it was just an expositional episode. They were wanting the action. And what they were doing is they were building it up. And so I remember thinking, like, how are they going to pull off this epic confrontation? And my observation of it was they followed the three-part structure for the episode and they broke the battle down into those three acts. So the first one, they give you your classic army fight with ground and flight battles. That would satisfy anyone who likes your classic, army confrontation. But you can't keep it like that the whole time. I know I would start to get a little sleepy. So in the Act 2 tone shift, that's where it takes a breather. You start focusing on people. You have people hiding out in the castle. You have dragons up in the sky. Like one dragon is killing the other. You find out the Night King can't be killed by dragonfire. Like all these are now based off of character development and raising the stakes. So that's all of Act 2 right in the middle. And then, of course, people still want their violence, right? You got to get back into it. So then Act 3, and that's when you know that the point of Act 3 is the minute the Night King raises the dead. And oh my God, you have a huge army now that you didn't have before. And it's a full-on zombie invasion leading up to the epic showdown where the Night King takes on Bran, and at the very last second, Arya swoops in and kills him, and the threat is gone. And I rewatched this week for this episode, for this recording, and I was like, oh my God, it's like, say what you want about the very ending finale, but that episode was so epic. I wish it had just ended there. I don't mean, I don't know how big it could have, but it was a great example of the three plot confrontational structure.
Yeah, there's a lot of usage of a like yes but no and
Mhm.
structure where like just things, it operates in the same way that any story should, where there's highs and lows in the narrative, and the stakes keep changing depending on uh you know what happens next. So if you want to say, uh the part I always remember is the Dothraki charge at the very beginning of the fight, and they have
Mhm.
like all the fire on their weapons, uh, and it's like, oh, did they get fire weapons? And it's like, yes, but they almost immediately get annihilated, which is like that really like one of the best things you can do for a large, I mean, really for any battle scene, but I feel like a large one in particular, because there's always a lot of build up to it, is like setting the stage for just how much danger your heroes are in, because it's like, okay, like we know like there have been encounters with the White Walkers before, but like in this particular case it's like we want to see like, okay, how screwed are we? It's like, well, we sent all our cavalry in to fight with flaming weapons, which we know is one of the few weaknesses of a White Walker, and they're almost all dead, and this is only the beginning of the fight. So from there it's like, oh geez, where can the battle possibly go from here?
That's actually my favorite part, is when you kind of set up this expectation and then it almost has like comedic value to it when you immediately extinguish its potential. And you're like, "Oh shit, that plan did not work." And now we're all kind of in the dark. No one knows what to expect. And I love that because sometimes when you go into the battle having an idea of what's going to happen, you're going to assume, okay, I can kind of predict what's going to happen now. But to do a reverse on them, I thought that was great.
Absolutely, especially like when, and you mentioned like the scene where they resurrect, uh they resurrect the dead, and then
Mhm.
the army just gets bigger, and it's like most people probably saw that coming, but at the same time, you know let's assume that you didn't. And typical battle structure, it's like anytime the good guys start getting the upper hand at about like the act 2 mark, and then you're like, okay, what is something's gonna mess it up because they can't win here. Like this
Mm-hmm.
is too premature. And then that happens, and it's just like, oh, great, we're even worse off than we were before.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I remember the night it first aired, and I'm watching on the edge of my couch, and I'm just like, what is going to happen? I felt like there was just so many great things about that series before reaching the end. Like for example, I don't remember if it was that season or the previous season, but when Daenerys loses her dragon and it becomes a night dragon or ice dragon, I can't remember now. I would just remember like being heartbroken,
Oh, yeah, it's
so.
horrifying. It's horrifying. One of the biggest assets that they have like got turned over to the bad guys.
Hmm. What other advice do you have for structures of fight scenes?
So I tried to go for I tried to think of a very different kind of fight scene compared to, because you had told me that you were going to do the long night, and I was thinking like, okay, I don't want to do a big climactic battle. Like what's another example of a fight scene I could outline? And I decided to go with the duel between Inigo and the Man in Black from The Princess Bride.
Yes. Okay.
Uh, and I mean, can you tell that I love sword fights? I just love sword
They're
fights.
great.
But so, and now this is great because I mean, this fight is like, I don't know, it's like 4 minutes, maybe a little less than that. It's pretty short, but you can find the 3 act structure of it. Uh, you know, I mean, the stage gets set first of all as like, we don't, all we really know about both characters is that Inigo has spent his whole life learning to sword fight and that he wants to avenge his father's murder. And the Man in Black, who is, very obviously Wesley. I think even first time viewers could
Mhm.
possibly guess that. But even then, we don't know a whole lot about him other than he was strong enough to climb up the cliff and he loves Buttercup. And that's about all we know.
Mhm.
Uh, but it's not between a hero and a villain. It's two characters that we kind of like both of them.
Mhm.
Like we don't necessarily want one to triumph over the other, but now we're just kind of like, oh, like what's going to happen here? And it starts off like, it starts off with they're just kind of sizing each other up. Inigo disadvantages himself by fighting left-handed, and they chat about different fencing styles, and so we can see like, okay, they're both familiar with the school of fencing, so they're both at least on the same level. And then finally, Inigo's like, well, like I think you're better than I am, but I'm not left-handed, and then he switches hands, and that's about where Act 1 would end. So now Inigo overpowers him, and then Wesley's like, I'm not left-handed either, and then he actually manages to disarm him, and Inigo is shocked, uh, and because he's like, wait, like what? Like this guy's actually even better than I thought. I completely underestimated him. It's almost like the equivalent of being like, this isn't my final form.
Mhm.
Uh, uh, and that's where Act 2 ends, where you have both of them. Now they are both have kind of revealed that they're not holding back any longer. And then in Act 3, they're really going at it now. Like this, there's no playing around. You can see that like Inigo's actually starting to get frustrated. He can't believe that there's someone that's better than him. And at the end of it, he's like, they're doing like a very classic kind of fencing style. Then Inigo like takes his sword in 2 hands and just starts swinging it at Wesley, just so angry. And then Wesley wins because of that. And Inigo's all sweaty and he's in disgrace. And then Wesley doesn't even kill him. He just knocks him out. And like instantly we feel bad for Inigo because we know that he, really thought he was like the best of the best and that he has an admirable goal. But Wesley also doesn't kill him. He says
Mhm.
like, I hold you in high respect. I'm not going to kill you. So he just knocks him out.
Mhm.
And so now you have both, we not only are sympathetic towards one character, but now we also have kind of shifted to the point of view of a different character, and then we follow Wesley's perspective for pretty much the rest of his time.
I love that fight scene. I didn't watch Princess Bride until I was in my late teens when it came on, like I think it was Comedy Central late at night. And I remember seeing that confrontation, and I didn't even watch it from the beginning because cable. And I remember instantly thinking, I love these two characters, and I don't know much about their backgrounds at all, but just the way that you see that character development, and of course the comedy, and the fact that they kind of left, in a positive, way, as you were saying.
Yeah,
But that's
because I
such a
mean,
great one.
the stakes aren't like too high. Like, I mean, and it's pretty like lighthearted mostly for the whole thing, and it's a great example of a fight scene where the goal isn't necessarily A defeats B, but more like we get to see each character's prowess and kind of how they stack up against each other. And then also like that presents a relationship later on, because like when they're teaming up to rescue Buttercup, it's like, Inigo knows, oh, the man in black beat me, like then he must be able to help us.
Hmm. I love that. It says a lot about that. Did you ever watch their reread over the pandemic with the actors? They did it
I
live.
I did not, but I do remember reading about that.
Okay, the actor for Inigo was so into it. You could just likable people, likable characters. That's a great example. I actually have a question for you that a listener submitted. Are you ready to,
Ooh,
to move on to this?
yes, please.
Okay, so I put out a story on Instagram asking people to submit their questions ahead of time, and I got one for this specific topic. The question is, how do you make fight scenes feel frantic?
Ooh, that is a good question. I think the best way to, if we're talking about writing it down, not in movies, if we're talking about writing it down, I think the best way to do it is to really stick in the character's head and show that they feel frantic.
Hmm.
It's not necessarily in how you show because obviously in movies you can show how frantic it is, like just with the camera work or
Hmm.
the choreography. But if you have like if your character, I don't know, like if your character is fighting down, I don't know, if they're sword fighting and he's completely inept, like you want to kind of show that, like tell me, like, well, how does the sword feel in his hand? Are his hands sweaty? Does it feel awkward? How, like, what does it sound like when his opponent is battering him with his sword? Like, what is he feeling the vibration of his arm? Like, is the blade like inches away from his face? Like, really get inside their head and what they're feeling. Like, I don't really need to know physically what's happening, but I need to know how the character is feeling.
Hmm.
Like if you make it, if you show uh, what they're feeling, like, and how they're feeling frantic, like you can make the fight feel more frantic that way. And especially like if you kind of set the stage early on with like just how like if it's a chase kind of fight scene, like if they're trying to like sort of run away and fight at the same time, it's like, well, what are they running from? Where are they trying to get to? uh, you know, Make the reader feel that franticness by going deep into the point of view of your character.
Yeah, and it's a great question. And I wrote it down, but didn't think about it because I knew I was going to be surprising you with it. And I didn't want to come in like unfair with anything planned. So thinking about this question too right now in the moment, other ways too that you can create something frantic. My thought was, depending on the circumstance, of course, everything is so different depending on the story you're writing. But I always think that if you can jump POVs with cliffhangers between those POVs, if it suits the story, that helps me with like feeling like, oh my gosh, what's happening next? What's happening next? Because I like the use of cliffhangers, and whether that or like shorter chapters. To kind of make it feel more frantic and the movement is going. There's one book I read. Oh gosh, The Incredible Life of Sia something. I'm gonna butcher it. I'll correct it later. It's a story about a girl whose mother disappeared, and so she lives in the Tucson area. I got the book because it had saguaros on the cover, and she thinks her mom could have been abducted by aliens or something like that. And so every night she goes out with a candle and has a lot of Hispanic Mexican cultural things. It's a great book. And at the end of the story, the book already has very short chapters, but then when you get to the final confrontation, the chapters are like a page and you find yourself flipping. So then you have the physical feeling of that franticness too associated with it. So I always thought that was such an interesting way to make a fight scene seem chaotic.
Yeah, chapter length and point of view can definitely affect that. I'm glad you mentioned that because if you're doing like a kind of thriller pacing thing where they're very short chapters and each end of the chapter is kind of cliffhanger-y, like that is definitely going to keep the reader like, but like, wait, what's going on?
Mm-hmm.
And the point of view thing, especially because if you have multiple point of view characters, not everyone does, but if you are doing a large point of view battle and you shift around to different perspectives. Like you can have it like, oh, one character was fighting and then they, I don't know, they got hit in the leg and they go down. And then you cut to another character and then it's like, oh no, wait, like I wasn't like, wait, I'm not done with them. But oh, what's happening here? Like so-and-so is like trying a really dangerous stunt or something like that. And that's another way to keep things feeling frantic with not just the overall action itself, but with what you're doing with the pacing of your story.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was it for my questions. I really enjoyed talking to you about fight scenes because it's always a joy to have speculative conversations with you. Do you have any final words of advice for writers that want to wrap their heads around fight scenes?
Just reiterate what I said before, less is more. In most cases with fight scenes, they don't need to be very drawn out. Like, as long as we care about the character or characters and you get inside their head, you can still build a really cool action set piece with some cool powers. Like, I don't know, if your character can fly or whatever, has some kind of super strength ability, you can have all that stuff in there and show off their abilities. But at the end of the day, we just want to feel thrilled. And the best way to do that is to just stay in the character's head, stick as close to them as you possibly can.
Speculative Sandbox is a volunteer-run podcast that relies on the collaboration of fellow creators like you. Join the conversation and participate in fun polls and questionnaires on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Interested in being in a future episode? Our DMs are open, or you can email speculativesandbox@gmail.com.